We're going to briefly review the brain anatomy, and then next week we will review the neurons and neurotransmitters. It's important as we go forward in neurobiology to have a basic understanding of the brain. And so when we talk about psychiatric disorders, we know these disorders are brain-based. They are physiologically based. It is not because we had a bad mom. It's not because we have a weak personality. There is something awry in the brain, and that's what we will be learning about this semester. So we know that psych disorders, they're broken brains. All symptoms of psychiatric disorders can be linked to physiological changes in the brain. And several years ago, several of our nation's governing health bodies came out, in the world, health bodies came out together. The World Health Organization, the National Institute of Health, and the Center for Disease Control all came out with a statement. And it's rare that these three bodies can agree on anything, but they did agree that psych disorders are physiologically based. And this was wonderful when this information was released to the public, and it has certainly gone a long way to decrease the stigma of these disorders. But of course, in that area, much more work is needed. But we now know that what causes psych disorders. And as we go forward this semester, we'll be looking at each psychiatric disorder, and we will be discussing what is going wrong in the brain with this particular disorder. But essentially, we do not inherit the disease, but we might inherit the genetic vulnerability to the expression of the disease. So our mother could have bipolar. That does not necessarily mean that we will have bipolar, but it certainly does mean we have an increased vulnerability to having bipolar. And so the development of a psychiatric disorder does have to do with life event stressors as well. However, the old theory of causation for schizophrenia was having a cold refrigerator-like mom. This does not cause schizophrenia, but it could contribute to the development of schizophrenia. So if our mother has schizophrenia, we have that genetic vulnerability. And then if our mother also treats us very bad, if she exhibited a lot of the negative symptoms we see in schizophrenia, and we didn't receive warmth and emotional connectivity to our mother, then those two reasons can lead to the expression of the disease. But essentially, we do inherit the genetic vulnerability, and whether or not we we develop the disease will depend on our life event stressors. Have we had exposure to multiple traumas? It will depend on our personality, our coping skills, and our social support. So how have we learned how to cope with problems? How has our personality developed? And then it could, the last contributing factor could be influences on our gene. So, for example, with schizophrenia, there's a lot of research that says yes, we inherit the genetic vulnerability, but also viruses could play a role in developing schizophrenia. And we'll certainly talk about that more when we get to schizophrenia. So what happens is we inherit the genetic vulnerability, and So we have inherited the genetic vulnerability, and then something hits the genetic vulnerability, so to speak, or we sustain a hit from the environment, I should say, that leads to the expression of the disease. And the hit from the environment could be, again, stressors, how we learn to cope with problems, and perhaps an environmental influence. And there's several concepts that we'll be going over this semester. Several of these you may remember from psychopharm, those of you who have had psychopharm, such as upregulation and downregulation. Neuroplasticity is very important, and it is a topic we will be discussing this semester. And neuroplasticity is simply the brain's ability to structurally reorganize itself. And we can do this until the day we die. Our brain continues to be neuroplastic. However, it is the most neuroplastic in the first 2 years of life. And so I talk about often with students, if you have a 22-year-old who had severe trauma when he was 12 months old, and you had another client, same age, 21, who had the same trauma, but it happened at 7 years old, who would statistically be more likely to develop a psychiatric disorder? And a lot of students will say, well, it will be the child that's 7 years old because they remember the trauma. And that's not the case. It's actually the child that had the trauma at 11 months or a year old. Their brain's very neuroplastic, is very susceptible to trauma, and the brain can change from that trauma. Many treatments and we use in psych do harness the brain's ability to be neuroplastic. So this semester, what do we need to know as far as the psych disorders? The brain is very complex. We will only be talking about neurobiology as it relates to psychiatric disorders. We certainly won't go over all the structures of the brain, nor will we go over all the chemicals, but we will discuss the ones that are most pertinent to psychiatric disorders. And so what structures matter? Certainly the four major lobes do, the frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal. These are pictures of the lobes. The frontal lobe, of course, being a very important lobe when it comes to schizophrenia. The frontal lobe is the areas of our highest intellectual functioning. It helps us be able to plan and organize. It helps us be able to maintain proper orientation to person, place, and time. It is responsible for executive functions such as decision-making, planning, organizing, impulse control. It is responsible for our working memory, and it is the lobe that is most responsible for our personality. This discusses the prefrontal cortex, which is part of the frontal lobe, and we will learn this semester that this area of the brain is very, very important when it comes to aggression, especially impulsive aggression. First, I mentioned that the frontal lobe is the lobe of the brain that's the most responsible for our personality. And we first discovered this after a gentleman named Phineas Gage. I'm sure many of you are familiar with him, after he sustained an injury in which a tamping bore, he worked on the railroad, and the tamping bore went through his frontal lobe. Prior to his injury, he was a very respected man. He went to work every day. He never engaged in bad behaviors, didn't cuss, didn't drink, didn't fight, always on work on time. He had this injury, and amazingly, he survived. After the injury, though, he was not the same. He started engaging in bad behaviors. He cussed. He got in fights a lot. He showed up late from work. He drank. And this led to scientists to discover that the frontal lobe has a lot to do with our personality, and his frontal lobe was significantly damaged, which led to a dramatic change in his personality. The frontal lobe, you can see some frontal lobe abnormalities in people who have schizophrenia at a very young age. These are called neurological soft signs. We will be going over these when we talk about schizophrenia, but schizophrenia is a unique disease in that we can see signs of the disease before the disease actually presents. And so just very briefly, the temporal lobe, that is responsible for sounds, our hearing center of the brain. And of course, when we have auditory hallucinations, this area of the brain is also implicated. And the same for visual hallucinations. They will involve the sight center of our brain, the occipital lobe. The basal ganglia is at the hind end of our brain, And it is responsible for complex motor functions, but more importantly, it houses the extrapyramidal motor system. And many meds we use in psych adversely affect this area, which lead to the abnormal movement side effects we see from antipsychotics and even antidepressants. The parietal lobe, we mentioned this in class, but that is the lobe that lets us know that all of our body parts are present and accounted for. If we drop a pen and we bend down to pick up the pen, it's our parietal lobe that allows us to accurately grasp the pen. And it helps process sensory information such as pain, touch, and temperature. The limbic system is not a lobe, but it is a system of structures that work together, and we generally refer to the limbic system as the emotional brain, or in other words, it's an essential system for the regulation of emotions. The hypothalamus is a small but very complex structure. It regulates autonomic functions such as appetite, hunger, sleep-rest cycle, fight-flight, and body temperature. The thalamus is a major relay station from the brain. It takes in information from our 5 senses and decides whether or not these information should be sent to the frontal lobe for further interpretation. The hippocampus is responsible for learning and recall. Specifically, it converts short-term memory into long-term memory. The amygdala is a very small organ. It helps regulate anger, aggression, love, shyness. If you have a patient who has a very aggressive responsive to fear, then they probably have problems with the amygdala. And that is a very brief overview of the brain. We will be going into these structures and systems and